Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
We believe climate change is the greatest investment opportunity of our generation. That's why the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, AFGIB, is investing for generational climate returns. Join Africa's Green Investment Bank and its partners for action on the just transition and emissions reduction targets in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt for an epic 2022 African COP27. The African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, AFGIB, committing capital to a climate-safe future.
My name is Hubert Danso. I am the chairman of Africa Investor, the African Union Continental Business Network, the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Funds Forum, and the CFA's Global Asset Owners Advisory Council, and the board for the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I will facilitate today's dialogue. I would firstly like to thank each of you present for taking the time out of your busy COP26 schedules to be here with us. We are convening at a critical time, literally hours before the conclusion of the COP26 negotiations, where we urgently need to restore confidence and solve the vintage just transition, adaptation and mitigation finance pledge, which are asking Africa, which represents, as many of you know, only 3 to 4% of cumulative global CO2 emissions, to forego the development of our 15.2 trillion of proven fossil fuels and reserves as an endowment in return for a share of a pledged 100 billion per annum high vintage adaptation and mitigation promise. Trust needs to urgently be restored, and the investment community needs to be on guard, as it seems that there is real political momentum at COP26 that sees that responsibility for the adaptation financing passing to the private sector. This will mean that there will be an ever greater need for the private capital community to create de-risking frameworks and pathways for institutional capital to flow to fund Africa's net zero transition, which will need to be urgently tabled by the institutional investment community to encourage governments to take out the political duration and currency risks to enable the $100 trillion plus pools of private capital to flow in support of the green transition, especially in emerging markets and developing countries. To this end, the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank Partnerships Dialogue on Enabling Institutional Investor-Public Partnerships has again convened the world's leading institutional investment community CEOs and leaders from across the continent and around the globe during COP26 because of our collective recognition about the urgent need to forge and implement innovative institutional investor-public partnerships to de-risk and mobilize the just transition, adaptation and mitigation funding that within a hospitable, predictable and enforceable legal and regulatory environment, asset owners, we believe, can leverage up to crowd in large pools of capital and co-investment to decarbonize portfolios and the green and essentially green the real economy. And thus, as a consequence of that, address Scope 3 emissions, which are, as we know, 70% of our collective challenge to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2063, and the African Continental Free Trade Area. Recognizing that Scope 3 emissions represent 70% of the required carbon reductions and predominantly come from industry and the private sector, the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank and our domestic and global investment partners believe with the appropriate policy and regulatory framework in place, given the continent's under-industrialization, the continent is uniquely positioned to leapfrog the transition faster than potentially OECD markets, and therefore believe that investing in greening the $3.2 trillion African Continental Free Trade Area that was launched this year in January, which is the world's largest free trade area since the establishment of the WTO, is a measurable and impactful platform for institutional investors to positively deliver Scope 3 reductions in Africa on commercial and inclusive terms. And again, if facilitated through an institutional investor-public partnership framework as espoused by the African Union's 5% institutional infrastructure investment agenda and championed by championed as a global public good by the CFA Asset Owners Council in New York. Today's dialogue, in keeping with the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank AFGIB Road to COP27 theme and series, will be on the role of these partnerships to support Africa's green transition, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and COP27, that, as we know, will be hosted in Africa, probably around this time, November next year, under the Egyptian COP presidency, and this event will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh. Our stated goal and aim remains for this forum to design and deliver greater public-private finance mandate alignment and more catalytic private investment pathways that fast-track and scale private capital's participation in the green transition, implemented through institutional investor-public partnerships such as the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank. Today's dialogue will commence with a keynote opening ceremony, followed by a briefings segment with two high-level briefing announcements, one on the International Energy Agency's Africa Research Briefing Report, and then the other on our model law on institutional investor public partnerships initiative, where the model law's draft preamble will be launched. This will be followed by a consultative investor panel on the road to COP27. It will be a dialogue on institutional investor public partnerships, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and Scope 3 institutional investor strategies. To accomplish these goals, I'm delighted again to partner with the world's foremost institutional investment leaders and advisors, committed to finding alignment and arresting the huge economic and climate damage to our economies caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and charting a prosperous and resilient pathway for investment partnerships with the continent that support the African Union's 5% agenda, where African pension and sovereign wealth funds have committed to increase allocations to regional and domestic infrastructure investment opportunities through the IIPP framework. Our elite and distinguished speakers for our keynote opening ceremony include Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, the CEO of the African Union Development Agency, His Excellency Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, Ambassador Mary Wallach, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Marilam Frendo, who is the CEO of the Global Infrastructure Hub, and John, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce.
We believe climate change is the greatest investment opportunity of our generation. That's why the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, AFGIB, is investing for generational climate returns. Join Africa's Green Investment Bank and its partners for action on the just transition and emissions reduction targets in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for an epic 2022 African COP27. The African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, AFGIB, committing capital to a climate-safe future.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.